Okay, I must admit that in addition to being a great honor, and this is the most important speech in my career, I feel the great burden on my back. Let's tell the truth. The bar this year is somewhere up here, very, very high. So I was thinking at the hotel, what did the band feel that closed the Woodstock show? Jimi Hendrix, Santana, Slender Family Style, and Joe Cocker. So you say, well, after someone sings the hymn of the United States and the guitar and then turns it on fire, how can you go over the top? Is anyone capable of doing more than that? And then I said, well, this band is going to play at Woodstock to be more than Jimmy or better than Santana. They are going to play because that is what they really love. They're passionate about this. And the three things I'm really passionate about, and I told you before, you know that music is one of my passions. Obviously, if I'm at a RubyConf, it's because I love programming, but I'm also love giving talks. So I hope you feel this passion and go back with the idea that RubyConf Uruguay has been the best conference of your life.
Muchas gracias. Entonces, ¿cómo nace?
So how is this talk born? Because when I submitted my proposal is how I program Ruby, and the guys told me, well, your speech is just bullshit. So after that, in the email, there were about 5 spaces. I said, okay, and is this a joke? So I went down, and I scrolled down and said, okay, well, we want something that is more inspirational, something that really closes the conference. Okay, why speak about how I program Ruby? Let us say how Ruby programmed me. And if you look at the cartoon that I made with lots of love, this has nothing to do with putting forks on your head. Let me explain this now so nobody sets any false expectations on this. So who am I? I am Jano Gonzalez, trying to be better than Jimi Hendrix, which is impossible. And right now, I work in a Chilean startup which is called Hop In. And this month, we produced a product that is called WebNote, which is bookmarking reimagined for your iPad. This has nothing to do with a presentation, but I want my colleagues, when I go back to Chile, to go on talking to me. And I'm one of the leaders in the dynamic languages in Chile. And this is the address if you ever go to the city and want to make a presentation there. So this is what I tell my wife who's seated there. That is what I tell her what we do. But we also do this. We do this more than the other. Now, well, that's enough about me. So this was a bit long, so I'm not so nervous. Now let us go into the topic. I'm going to speak about language and thought, and more specifically, how language shapes somehow our thought, the way we think. And this is a problem that has been studied from the times of what came first, whether the chicken or the egg, because they are so closely linked, language and thought, that it's difficult to know what comes first. Unfortunately, I'm not a linguist. I am not a philosopher, nor a neuroscientist, so I'm just going to speak about my experience. I'm going to give you my opinions, but don't you worry. This is not like Hacker News when you have a lot of geeks speak about things they don't know a clue about, like politics or sexuality and that.
but rather I'm going to focus my talk on something that is much more specific. That is, how programming languages gradually modeled the way I think as time went by. And I hope that this experience is similar to yours. I think that I'll get closer to the computer. So, this was prepared. This is the break so that you may digest the idea. So how's the programmer's brain? If I were a neuroscientist, obviously, I would show an MRI of the brain. But this, for me, is our brain. It's just clay waiting to be modeled by the proper hands. So, what are the proper hands? What are the hands that should model this clay? There's a problem that was already discovered at the time of Hippocrates, the father of today's medicine. Ars longa, vita brevis. I imagine that all of you know Latin, so it's not even worth translating it, but he says ars longa, vita brevis. That means that there's such a huge spectrum of things that we have to know or to be learned, but the time that we have to learn it is very short. So how do we choose? What are the hands that model the gray matter? There's a guy that has 1,000 or maybe 1,000,000 quotable quotes. That's Alan Perlis. And he says that a language that doesn't affect the way you think about programming is not worth knowing, because we have a lot of paradigms. Again, you see, I'm interrupting myself. This is what in psychology we call self-sabotage. We have many paradigms. We have different types of syntax, and not just syntax, but idioms that I don't even know how to translate into Spanish. He says those small conventions of how we use the language, and the most important thing, just as with language, the programming languages also have a community supporting them. For instance, in Ruby, we have everything is object, everything is an expression. We have the blocks, for instance. That's something that makes us think of problems in a rather different way than we used to think before we knew Ruby. JavaScript, a very vilipendiated language that has triggered many millions of pages of bullying against language. But there are things that make us think different. For instance, I came from a world where all the objects were created from classes, and I know the orientation of objects, but with prototypes. So this changes the way I think of objects, something that I took for granted in a language that is cornered by everybody. I learned new things. For instance, Python. Python has something very special. It is absolutely mandatory to indent things, to do indentation in our codes. In a way, this is a constraint, but sometimes constraints make us improve things. In this case, in Python, to avoid the death pyramids in our codes, in a way we are forced to write functions or methods that are much smaller, that are within the others. So the very language is somehow shaping our mental process when we are programming. For instance, Lisp. If we can't omit Lisp if we are speaking of programming. The specific thing, the unique thing is about them is that there's almost no borders, no frontiers between the data that we are operating, and that allows us to do the macros. This is an example that I don't even understand, that it was drawn from Paul Graham's book. the master, and it creates a loop for in lips. So it creates something that didn't exist in language. These are things that change the way you think of the way you program. Or for instance, Haskell, that has all this thing of typing, referential transparency, laziness, and it has something that is not in all other languages, is pattern matching. With the parameters that I receive, it's sort of as if I said, well, if I put a screen and things go through this and not through that. So it changes the way I think of method. Or languages like Forth. Forth is a stack-based language. That means that instead of having explicit parameters, the idea is that all the functions will operate on a stack of values. So it makes me really change the way I think of problems. The other thing is that it has RPN syntax. That also is a limitation. So if I write a very long function, nothing is understood. So it makes me think in terms of small functions, short functions. So what's the idea of learning all these languages? It's like doing a remix of everything we learn. Yesterday, for instance, we learned about cellular, that is the model of actors taken to Ruby. It's an old idea, then became mainstream with Erlang, and then we took it to a new context. So, knowing what happens in other places, that is what really makes us grow as programmers. Yesterday we heard about Datomic, for instance, of the Clojure community, and we see how all those ideas of not distinguishing between codes and data were now taken to a database. So it's good sometimes to look at the side to bring that knowledge to your own world. Now, it's not just taking a book or starting to write a code and that will make you understand everything immediately. No, we need a mental status that may really give a chance to languages to model, to shape the way we think. There is a tradition in the geek world that doing it rant papers to complain about things, like the method go to consider harmful. We also have this real programmers don't use Pascal. So the ed post in its complaint says a real programmer can write Fortran in any language. So if we are close-minded, we are always going to go back to our origin and we won't adopt the new mentality. So all of us believe that we are Chuck Norris. No, I'm a Ruby expert, I'm an expert in Python. And if we change, we bring all that, because after being Chuck Norris, who would like to be a one-year-old baby? Nobody. But we could look at examples. Here there are people of the conference. My apologies, please, because I'm going to use speakers. For instance, as an example, Jim, he's a true Chuck Norris of Ruby. For 13 years, he's programmed with Ruby. And I remember a famous paper that said, learn how to program in 10 years. He said that you only turn into a master after 10 years of programming. But I looked at Jim, and after many talks, he continued to take notes. And Jim, it's not just anyone, and even so, he's still open to learning. So that leads us to think as to what should be the state of mind that we should have. We should be more open to what's coming. There's a concept in martial arts that's called chochin. It's appropriate to mention it because Ruby is from Japan, martial arts are from Japan. Basically, it refers to the beginner's mind. What are the characteristics of the beginner's mind? It's like an open book. It's a blank book. It's free of any preconceptions, and it's ready to absorb all the incoming knowledge. There's a story that I'm sure that you may have heard a million times. As a matter of fact, the first time I heard it, it must have been from Alan Cement, that must be here. There he is, raising his hand. As a matter of fact, he could come here and explain it 1,000 times better, but I'm going to do my best, Alan. A university professor goes to visit a Zen master, and the Zen master very kindly offers him a cup of tea and starts pouring the tea, and pours tea and pours tea, and all of a sudden the cup was spilling over, and the professor said, "Stop, stop, master. The cup is spilling. It's so full, it's spilling. This cup is like you. You got here full of your own ideas, your opinions, your prejudice. If you want me to teach you Zen, you must get rid of all those. So empty your cup." So that is my message. Empty your cups and be open to learn new things. Being in the audience is a good exercise. Being open to what the speaker is doing is very good. Here we have superstars of the code that are still open and are still ready to learn. That's what we should do ourselves. Now, how do you get to be a teacher? There's a model that's called Dreyfus model. If I'm not wrong, 5 steps to master. But 5 is too much to explain in a talk, so let's simplify. Let's go back to martial arts, and let's go to the Chu-Harry concept. Those are 3 stages in the status of the learner, of the apprentice in martial arts. The first is Shu. It's when we do everything following the rules we are taught. We don't challenge anything, and we do everything based on what the master tells us. Then we have the Ha. It's where we get rebellious. It's like adolescence in learning. That is there that we try to incorporate our own things and move away from the laws. No, that was hard. It was to see whether you were paying attention. Nobody correct me. So much Japanese, I was afraid you might fall asleep. Finally, we have Re. That is complete detachment. This is the state in which we are. There are no more rules to obey. There are no rules to break. There are simply no rules. It's when we have reached the status of the real masters. But this is a Ruby conference and not frustrated martial artists. So let's go back to our topic. I came here to talk about Ruby and my brain, or how Ruby in a way changed my brain. So let's give an allegory that it's a story of 2 developers, the hacker versus the thinker. So, what are the characteristics of a hacker? It's somebody who gets things done. Somebody gets check done. It's very hands-on. It's a person who solves the problems. Usually he does it fast, but it also has its own sins. Hackers are gonna hack. They're always going to see how they can trick you with the language to do something for which it was not created, because that's the way the hacker's mind works. It looks for all those winding loopholes in language to try to use it in a different way. And there's a nightmare to maintain that code. So the attitude of a hacker is like, this needs some more duct tape, and puts on more and more duct tape. On the other hand, we have the thinker. It's somebody who has a much more abstract thought. And he says, no, but will this be maintained in the future? The problem is that very often the sin is to go so abstract that the person forgets what problem he was trying to solve. Oh, I have an abstract factory. What was I trying to solve? A system to use vineyards, but I got lost in the abstract factory, in the command pattern, and so on. And he also has a problem that he thinks, but the mental thought is just thinking and not doing. So it's the analysis paralysis. He thinks and he falls asleep, and when he wakes up he says, a whole day has gone by and I didn't draw a single line, a code line. I've been there. The solution for him is to be a consultant of a company with a 3-letter company, and they told them, come and let us help the Pisa wall. Well, let's put another story and everything will be solved, as if everything just needed an additional layer to be solved. That's like his philosophy. So how do I connect this with my story? That's a difficult task, such diffuse concepts, trying to have them converge in a point, but bear with me.
So we will get to that point eventually. Now, what is my story? As many of you know, I was a real hacker. One day I saw that there was a command called all basic. And I was curious about that because a couple of years before I had seen BASIC in Atari. I said, well, I wonder if that's the same. So I entered in the QBasic and I found this screen here. I didn't understand anything. And fortunately enough, at that time, young learners had the RTFN mentality. So I looked for the manual to see how that worked. And I saw that many programs came as examples. First of all, the gorilla.bas. So now the problem was that I worked in my mother's office where these lovely 2H6 computers had come with the Hercules monitors. And when this gorilla.bas came, I executed it, and I needed 4 colors in the video card so that it would work. And I had a monochrome monitor. So I said, how do I make this run? So if I were American, I would say I hacked my way out of the problem. So I hacked myself around like in the jungle with a machete. And instead of machete, I had a 12-year-old's fingers and the QBasic guide on the side. So that was my explorer's guide. So I started to copy codes and delete things, and eventually I made it work. Now, the problem was that about 6 years later, because I said, well, this game is too easy. If I throw out the banana, the guy dies anyway. And only 6 years later, I realized that the game did not work that way, but I introduced very serious bugs into the application. But somehow, as an innocent 12-year-old, I managed to do something that I must admit. I was introduced as the great Jano Gonzalez. The Jano Gonzalez gets this gorilla.bas and said, well, make this work on a Hercules monitor. And that is where all the grandiosity got away. Jano Gonzalez got depressed and committed suicide because it's difficult to go back to that mental state. So what happened afterwards? The learning years came. I had a cousin who had started to learn IT. I was 16 years old by then, and in a machistic society like Chile, I had to go through a ritual to become a man. That is a social pressure. So my cousin said, you should become a man, and he gave me this book. And to tell the truth, I thought you were going to bring me a pisco bottle or a bottle of beer, but he came with this book here and a lot of diskettes with a compiler called JGPP. So this, I started to learn, and I started to learn from many of the books. Then my mother gave me a book. She said C++. If it's plus plus, it's going to be great. So she bought this for me. And when I was 17, and before going into university, I prepared linked lists and binary trees, but I didn't know what the heck that would be useful for. So I started to depart from the original path and to learn solutions without knowing what problems I had to solve. And then I got to university. I studied at a Java school, and I was prepared for the cubicle world. And I got to the darkest part of my life, which are the UML years. One day I'm going to prepare a documentary. It's going to be called the UML years. But a best picture to show those years would be this picture here. So what happened? The hacker was gone. There was like a new and improved Jano who got into the ABB, acronym-driven development, ADB. If I had no acronyms, this was no use. UML, RUP, the gang of four patterns, XML, Java EE, and all those things. And I'm not a psychologist, and I said I wasn't going to speak about things that I'm not familiar with. But I think I suffered the syndrome, the Stockholm Syndrome. Now, why? Because my kidnappers, I didn't see them as kidnappers. I saw them as people who were helping me. And I thought I had evolved as a programmer. So I felt into the greatest untruth ever, is to think there's only one true way to follow. And then at the end of that path, you had perfection. So what is the problem with the path? It's that it makes us afraid. Because if you know that you have to reach Montevideo, you have to follow that path, and all of a sudden you start walking, and you realize, oh, I got off the track. And I start to get afraid because I'm going to reach destination. And that is what happens to us as programmers when we think there is only one single destination. And I thought that all this of modeling and processes and RUP was a way. But I was so very wrong, because everyday life is the path. And here, I think I'll try to tell the story the best way possible. So a student asked the teacher, "Teacher, what is the path to follow?" He said, "Everyday life is a path." And the student didn't understand very much. So how can I study that path? And the master says, he hit them. He hit them first about 2 or 3 times. That's the way I imagine it worked. And the master says, well, if you study the way, what are you worrying about? And then the student was totally confused. So the master said, to follow the path, you have to think about the sky, about heaven. Well, nobody understands anything. Okay, so the objective of the Zen story is that the student shouldn't understand anything, that the student should feel stupid for a couple of days, and then all of a sudden he is enlightened. So 10 days later, you send me a tweet. But the funny part of the story is that each person draws a different conclusion. If not, it wouldn't be sent. And my conclusion is that we're sometimes so much concerned about studying the correct way of doing things that we don't even worry about doing things at all. So in that dark period of my life where I wasn't familiar with this ultimate truth, Ruby came in. Enter Ruby. My wife is not called Ruby, so only the language Ruby came in to my life. Now, what is a fun thing about Ruby? It is small talk in pearls disguise. In a presentation I gave the other day, I made the mistake of saying small talk wearing a pearl suit, but the programmers don't wear a suit. So it's like someone who lets the beard grow and they say, well, that is Ruby. Ruby has a capacity of making the two programmers happy that I was telling you about, but that they don't do Stack Overflow with all these stories I'm telling you. So the thinker can see that a proxy pattern of the Gang of Four can be as simple as this here, recovering the original spirit of small talk without the verbosity of all the other languages that I won't mention and occupied my life for over a decade. And then that was a conclusion of the thinker. We also make the hacker happy. The hacker has one-liners such as this. I know the Ruby community wants to renegade of these, but you cannot deny your roots. Ruby cannot deny that it's inheritance of Perl. So we reach this status where we are aware that in our minds there are two programmers. And that is what I realized. I had a hacker in me as well. I was somewhere lost inside my head, and I had this thinker. And Ruby told me they can work together. They can work together in harmony. So a language that comes from Japan releases us of the philosophical Occidental Western tradition, and it makes you think of abstractions. You cannot think, you cannot have a thinker without a hacker. So that is the truth that Ruby made me come closer to. So this is like a one-liner, but it has a concept of functional program. So the both are happy together, they're working together, and they get on well. Now, what is the good thing about Ruby? It brings us close to the truth. The path is no path, because Ruby has many superstars with well-defined styles. Ruby is the language that allowed the DHH language to fit into this. It is a very heavy form with many abstractions, but Rails was possible thanks to Ruby. And on the other hand, an artist like Why the Luckiest Thief was capable of expressing their creativity with Ruby language. Or going to the Latin American side, someone like Michel Martens could think the minimalist philosophy and also do this through Ruby. So Ruby doesn't show one single path, but it makes us discover our own path. And in addition to that, I discovered something that was incredible, that all developers are managers, because we manage the hacker and the thinker to live in harmony. Oh my God. So If someone has more than 2 programmers in their heads, please consult a physician, because if not, that would be complicated. But Ruby not only changed my way of thinking, but Ruby changed my life. It changed my life completely. How did Ruby change my life? New work, thrilling work and work, this helm. I can use just anything. I can go to many conferences and learn a lot from so many people. I can even make my small contribution to the community. I can make new friends. Like this horse's head, which was very well known at the RubyConf in Argentina. Most of the friends I have met are crazy. But I must admit that Ruby has humiliated me intensively. One of the worst humiliations in my life.
I'm not a football fan, but the first time that I went to a stadium in my life was in the last Uruguayan RubyConf. It was my turn to see from the Uruguayan seats how they played against my country, Chile. The problem is not that. The problem is what they were 4-0. We were beaten, but the friends that I met there make up for that, for that humiliation. As a matter of fact, yesterday Chile was beaten by Peru, so I am afraid that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they'll realize that whenever I leave the country, our national team loses. So I discovered that I don't just love Ruby, I love the Uruguay community and the Argentine community, and I hope that I will still continue to love many communities around the world. But before I leave with this message of peace and love, let me talk to you about Ruby and your lives, because that's why we're here, not to speak of myself, but of you. Let Ruby change your lives as they did mine. But it doesn't necessarily have to be Ruby. Let programming change your life. If you do something that you're passionate about, the most likely thing is that one way or the other, it may end up changing your life completely. As do fork and merge, for instance. Now, I'm not working with Ruby. Don't boo at me. I'm working with Node.js, because with Node.js it brings the bread to the table. So if that pays my salary, then I'll work with it. But in spite of all, in a way, I'm happy, because despite all the flaws that I find in Node, there are 1 or 2 things that I'd love to apply in Ruby. So every time you do fork in your professional lives, learn a lot and then go back to merge in your baseline. So my final message is learn. Be open-minded. Have fun with what you do, and then share it with the rest of the community and repeat it until you're fed up with it. Thank you.